Okay, we are recording. So, welcome everyone to the next talk for the Philosophy Speaker Series at Royal Holloway. We have this week Quill Kukla, who is Professor of Philosophy and Senior Research Scholar at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown University, where they are also a core faculty member in the Disability Studies program. Quill is the editor-in-chief of the Kennedy Institute of Ethics Journal, and for 2021-2022, they are a Humboldt Research Scholar at Leibniz University, Hanover. Quill's main areas of research are social epistemology, bioethics, philosophy of science, philosophy of language, and anti-oppression philosophy. And their talk today is entitled Telling Gender, the Pragmatics and Ethics of Gender Ascriptions. So Quill, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I've realized that if I share my slides in a way that works for you, I can't see you at all. So if you need to break in or anything, just shout at me, okay?
Will do.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for having me. I just want to mention before I start talking that, well, a couple things before I start talking. One is I have a very excitable corgi here with me, and sometimes when she hears a new voice, she barks for a second or two. So I'm sorry if that's disruptive. I'll try to keep her calm. The other is that this is a paper that's based on co-authored work with Mark Lance, and I'll probably move back and forth between using the first person singular and the first person plural, especially when I'm making points that I know are both of our points, so I hope that that's not too confusing. And that being said, I'll launch in. So what we're interested in this paper is thinking about what we're doing when we ascribe gender in language. So when we say things like, I am a man, or tell someone you are not a woman, or use gendered pronouns to describe someone, we want to think about why gender descriptive language like that matters, why people should care, for example, about which pronouns are used to refer to them. It seems like there's two seemingly straightforward answers to the question, why do gender ascriptions matter? One is you might think that they matter because they describe people correctly or incorrectly, and the truth matters, so we want to get things right. And the second is you might think, well, people's feelings can be hurt and they can feel disrespected when they're described or referred to in some way that's different from how they present themselves. And Mark and I believe that while both of these answers are right at times, neither of them really gets at the ethically and philosophically deep reason why speech acts like this matter. Rather, we want to claim that gender ascriptions function first and foremost to organize social space and to support or undermine people's autonomy and bodily agency and self-determination within that space in really important ways. So our central goal in this paper is to give an analysis of the discursive function of gender ascriptions, including thinking about when they're appropriate or inappropriate. And we want it to be pointedly independent of any particular theory of the metaphysics of gender. This is really essential for me and essential to the point of the paper. In arguing that gender ascriptions reorganize social space, we're going out of our way not to argue for the metaphysical thesis that they thereby constitute gender. So it's not a theory about the social production of gender itself. Likewise, in arguing, as I'm going to, that ethically speaking, people ought to have their self-ascriptions of gender respected, we're not arguing that gender itself is constituted by self-ascription. So it's not a self-ascription theory of gender. Rather, what we're doing is we're looking at how speech acts that ascribe gender position people in social space, quite regardless of whether that positioning matches or helps to constitute their gender. And what we want to argue first and foremost is that in most cases, gender ascriptions are not primarily truth claims, and that they're never merely truth claims. This is a thesis about the pragmatics of speech acts. So if that's right, then the question of whether they correspond to metaphysical reality misses the mark if we're trying to assess their felicity and their success as speech acts. Because we don't see gender ascriptions as primarily capturing and describing empirical features of reality, we hope that our account of gender ascriptions and their pragmatic and ethical structure is one that can be convincing to people who disagree on the metaphysics of gender, and even to people who deny that there is such a thing as a metaphysics of gender. So not that this functions in the talk, We specifically don't want it to function in the talk, but secretly on the side, both of us are suspicious that there could be such a thing as a metaphysics of gender to start with. So that's one of our motivations for wanting to give an account of the language which is cut free from that. So in order to make the case, I want to start with a brief introduction to speech act theory. This is hopefully all going to be familiar to most or all of you, but I think it's helpful to highlight some key points. So speech act theory is the part of philosophy that takes linguistic utterances to be actions that impact the social and material world, and then analyzes how those acts function. Philosophers frequently write as if the basic function of language is just to convey information, to describe what's true and false about the world. So they focus on declarative assertions such as Paris is the capital of France, or metals conduct electricity, and so forth. A key to the pragmatic functioning of claims like that is that the standard for assessing their success is whether they're true or not. But philosophers like Wittgenstein and Austin initiated an alternative tradition in philosophy of language. They emphasize that utterances are actions and that they can do all sorts of things other than convey information. So for example, orders are not true or false. Instead, what they do is they impose obligations on the people ordered. Invitations are speech acts that welcome someone to an event and make it permissible for them to go. Marriage pronouncements make people married and change their legal status. Promises bind speakers to act in a certain way. None of these are functioning primarily to convey information, and none of them, importantly, are true or false. I want to point out a few features of these non-declarative speech acts. So first of all, they have concrete material effects. Marriage pronouncements change people's tax burden, orders impact which actions happen next, and so on. Second, the characteristic way that speech acts causally affect the world is by reshaping social norms. What they do is they alter what is permissible or obligatory or socially appropriate, transgressive, legal, and so on. So for example, a baptism determines what it's appropriate to call someone, and a marriage pronouncement changes the married people's status as a couple in social and legal space. A promisor changes the promise's obligations to the promisee, and so on. Third, most of these speech acts have agent-relative authority conditions. What I mean by that is they can only appropriately and successfully be uttered by people with the right kind of social standing. So if I'm your professor, then I'm entitled to order you to write a paper by Tuesday, but I'm not entitled to order you to clean your room. And if I'm not your parent, I can't name you. And I always end up finding an excuse to work this example into almost every talk I give one way or another because I love it. You can't name babies by running down a maternity ward and shouting names in their direction, right? It won't succeed in naming them. If you try to utter one of these speech acts and you don't have the proper authority, it's going to be a misfire. Not only is the speech act going to be unsuccessful in shifting social space in the way characteristic of that type of speech act, but it's not going to be socially intelligible as an attempted intervention into social space. In fact, one of the things that's sort of distinctive about declarative speech acts is that anyone can make them, but this isn't the norm for speech acts. Okay, fourth, for all of these speech acts that aren't declaratives, assessing whether they're appropriately uttered isn't about assessing whether they're true or false. Instead, and this is going to be super important for me for the whole talk, the appropriateness of these speech acts hinges on two questions. First of all, whether they were performed with the proper authority, like in the way that my running down maternity hall and shouting names was not, right? That's the first one. And secondly, whether social space should be organized in the way that they organize it. That is to say, whether an order or a promise or a marriage pronouncement is appropriate is a combination of a question about whether it's performed with the proper entitlement so that it can have any kind of effect at all, and a question which is about ethics, not truth. So an order could be entitled or unentitled, and then separately, the obligations that are generated by the order might be ethical or unethical, right? Normative statuses that one should bring into being or shouldn't bring into being, but the order can't be true or false. Finally, it's important for my purposes that, as Austin pointed out, some speech acts have the grammar of declarative assertions, but they actually serve not to describe things truly or falsely, but instead to institute a social state of affairs. So consider when a chair says, "This meeting is adjourned." This sounds like a descriptive claim at the level of its grammar, but actually what it does is institute the end of the meeting, right? Or "I bet you $5. If I say that, it makes the bet, it doesn't describe a truth. "That's true" is an inappropriate response to either of those speech acts. And even an utterance like "it's really hot in here," which has the surface form of a declarative, in the appropriate circumstances might function primarily as a request to open the window or turn down the heat, rather than as a truth claim about the temperature. Okay, so that's my refresher course on speech act theory. Let's go back to gender ascriptions. If I call you my friend, what I'm doing is seeking to establish a social status between us. I'm not telling you what empirical properties you or I have. I'm letting you know how I'm going to treat you and how I expect you to treat me. There isn't any strict set of necessary and sufficient conditions for how friends should treat one another, any more than there are necessary and sufficient conditions for behaving like a man. But in calling you my friend, what I'm doing is proposing that we occupy relational roles that are going to give sense to and normatively inflect all the ways that we relate to one another. And if you say, "No, I'm not your friend," then we're really not having an empirical disagreement in the first instance. Instead, your negation is a rejection of my attempt to establish our relationship in social space. If I go on to cite facts about me or you, or to try to convince you that you're empirically wrong and I'm right about whether we're friends, I'm missing the point of how language functions. My speech act was a proposal, not a description, and your speech act was a rejection of that proposal. Even if in the future we were to discover some sort of complicated physical relationship that explained why people become friends or what their interactions are like once they're friends, that would be irrelevant at this point, right? Saying "you are my friend" doesn't describe that physical fact. It's a proposal, and it's a kind of an undertaking of a practical commitment to treat you in a certain way. Our central claim is that similarly, gender ascriptions are not primarily declarative claims, even though they typically have declarative grammatical form. And disagreements over gender descriptions aren't primarily disagreements over empirical facts. They're social negotiations over how someone's going to be positioned within social normative space. And we claim that gender ascriptions function in the first instance to alter and reorganize social space rather than to describe an antecedent reality. So we're claiming that calling someone a man is more like calling him a friend or saying "I bet you $5" than it's like calling him tall. And these kinds of ascriptions are best assessed not in terms of their truth or falsity, but in terms of whether they were performed with proper authority and whether their effects are ethically appropriate or not. I'm going to take some time to explain and defend this claim. So notice that what gender we are taking, this next point I hope is fairly obvious, but I think it's important to the argument. So notice that what gender we're taken as having inflects nearly every aspect of how we are expected and demanded to negotiate the social and material world. It shapes how we're supposed to hold our body, modulate our voice, what clothes we're supposed to wear, how we're supposed to manifest sexual attraction and attractiveness, where and how we pee, what hobbies and jobs we're supposed to have, who we compete against in sport events, what sports we take up in the first place, what our relationship is to our children, and so on. Even fetuses, once they're recognized as boys or girls, are expected to become babies for whom certain nurseries and clothing colors and emotions and behaviors are appropriate. These norms are modulated by race, age, ability, class, body shape, and more. It's not like there's just a single coherent set of norms for each gender. There's a complicated and often contradictory web of norms, and we're differently positioned within it. But these large structures of social significance are pretty inescapable. Now, of course, you can violate almost any of these gender norms. So people who are recognized as women can take masculine coded jobs. People who are recognized as men can wear makeup, and so on. You might try and fail to live up to gender norms that are perceived as applying to you, or you might defy gender norms. You can even try to change gender norms by resisting them from within. But when we do all of this, it's still clear that this is socially coded as a transgression. It's a pushing back against what's expected. Catherine Jenkins has argued that experiencing a set of gender norms as applying to and making demands on oneself even when one resists or fails to live up to those norms, is what it is to have a gender identity. And this is a metaphysical claim, and as I said, we're going to remain neutral on the metaphysics. So we're making a weaker claim that being recognized as having a gender, either by yourself or by other people, involves being positioned in normative space. The social recognition inserts us into a complex web of normative expectations and pressures. And this is true whether or not it turns out to be the case that on the proper metaphysics of gender, having a gender inserts us into norms in this way. Furthermore, and crucially, being socially recognized as having a gender normatively positions us in this way, regardless of the underlying metaphysics that anyone might appeal to in deciding whether to ascribe a gender to us, and regardless of whether we actually have the gender that we're recognized as having. That's a really important point. Now, as I mentioned, I take it that this point about the variety and ubiquity of gender norms is pretty obvious. So the point for us is that what we do when we ascribe gender and language to ourselves or to someone else is we give communicative recognition to the fact that someone is placed within gender norms. And by doing so, we help to insert them into this normative place and hold them there via mechanisms of social accountability. So even if someone feels like a set of norms applies to them, they're not going to be socially held to those norms until they are recognized as subject to them. And that's what we use gender ascription speech acts for. Again, this is so regardless of anyone's underlying metaphysical explanation for why the person is situated within the norms as they are. What holds people in and to these norms is our own and others' recognition of us as being bound by them. So you might feel the pull of a set of gender norms privately, for example, if you're trans but not in any way public yet about that identity, but you're not held to the norms that you feel the pull of with any kind of concrete accountability until there's some sort of public social recognition of that gender. So gender ascriptions then are socially potent speech. Just as marriage pronouncements insert people into the norms of marriage and betting someone $5 establishes that you're bound by the norms of betting, likewise, gendering someone in language places them in a gendered social space. And this is a performative effect of gender ascription. Telling someone that they have a gender doesn't merely state a purported fact about them. It has a complicated illocutionary force. It inserts them within this set of expectations and thereby has concrete consequences for what they can do, where they can go, whether others will accept them, and so on. In fact, I want to say that given the force and the persistence with which we are placed into gender norms, and the amount of hard work and disciplinary action it takes to keep people conforming to gender norms, which almost no one does perfectly, we might say that gender ascriptions jam people into gendered social positions and hold them there really hard. Of course, no one gender ascription slams us into a complicated normative position in a single moment, although gender reveal parties for fetuses try hard to accomplish this. Instead, each gender ascription recognizes how a person is already purportedly entangled in normative space, and in doing so, further entrenches and holds them in that space. And this is another similarity between a speech act like I am a man and a speech act like I'm your friend, because friendship also can't be instituted with a single speech act, at least not once you leave preschool, right? It has to be gradually instituted. It's partly because imposing gender norms is difficult and requires so much force that we need so many repetitions and iterations of gender placement in order for the social positioning to stick. This is something that Judith Butler argued very well in the early 90s. Okay, so at this point, someone might object and say, look, our gender ascriptions recognize which norms apply to a person, but they don't insert them into those norms. It's biology that makes a set of norms apply to a person, and all that our gender ascriptions do is reflect the normative facts that result from that biology. And I want to say it can't be our biology that inserts us into norms for two reasons, or at least not our biology alone. First, since the details of gender norms vary substantially from culture to culture and generation to generation and across the lifespan, biology alone can't determine exactly which social gendered norms apply to us. And notice that this is a different point from a point about whether biology causes us to have a gender identity, because that's a metaphysical question or maybe an ideological question, and we're not coming down on that. Regardless of the underlying relationship between biology and identity, biology just doesn't change nearly as much or as fast as gender norms do. So we need something other than biology to hold us into the specific norms. Second, even if biology determines some of the gender differences between us, it would determine what we do or are disposed to do and not what we should do. Right? It would be a straightforward naturalistic fallacy to assume otherwise. The norms that gender ascriptions recognize us as embedded in are social norms. And whether or not biology causes us to behave in various ways or have various gendered properties, our social accountability for our place within these norms can't be reduced to the biological fact that we are inclined to live up to the norms, if that happens to be a biological fact. We're held to the norms through social recognition, including self-recognition in the case of self-ascription. And in this sense, the norms are like marriage norms or tax norms or any other socially enforced norms, right? Even if our social norms mirror or riff upon biological differences between us, we still need social recognition to hold us to the norms. Biology on its own doesn't have the capacity to hold us accountable to anything. You might also object to our argument so far by insisting that gender ascriptions insert people into norms by describing them. So in saying someone is a man, I'm attributing some empirical properties to him, perhaps biological or perhaps social or psychological. And because he has these properties, he's subject to the relevant norms. Thus, the objection goes, gender ascriptions are still declaratives, they're just declaratives with normative consequences. And in contrast, what we're trying to claim is that the main thing that you're doing with language when you identify someone's gender is not pointing at an empirical property, it's setting social expectations for how they will act and present themselves and shaping the narrative paths open to them as they move through material social space. Now, there are social identities and properties that come with various empirical expectations, but for which there is no fixed substratum of empirical properties upon which they depend. And so I've picked what I hope are funny examples. To be socially recognized as a DJ, for example, makes it defeasibly reasonable for others to expect that you're going to do things like keep late hours and love and understand certain types of music and so on. It makes evaluations in terms of how well you DJ salient. It gives narrative structure and comprehensibility to your life choices and practices. Moving from Indiana to Berlin to look for work, maybe, or working on your DJing technique. This identity guides not only our self-understanding and our path through life, but the way that society gives us uptake. But there's no determinate set of empirical properties that one has to have to be socially recognized as a DJ. You can be recognized as a DJ who is out of work or on vacation or lacking in talent, or indeed who's never worked as a DJ at all, especially if you publicly claim this as your identity. Similarly, I think it was Ernie Lepore, and I have to apologize to Ernie if I am misattributing this to him, but I think it was Ernie Lepore who pointed out to me that there are no empirical facts or properties that are necessary for claiming that you're working on a book, right? You can be working on a book without ever putting anything down on paper and so forth. So being socially recognized as a friend or a DJ or as working on a book is about bringing a set of social expectations and sense-making resources to bear. It's about being recognized as occupying a location in normative social space. It's not about being attributed a fixed set of empirical properties, whether internal or external. And yet notice, you can perfectly well lie about being a friend or a DJ or a book writer. So these identities aren't simply metaphysically equivalent to their social recognition either. Now, when it comes to gender, we want to say that there's similarly no agreed upon fixed substratum of empirical properties that anchor our claims to social space or our disagreements over how to position people in social space. Claiming a gender and receiving social recognition as having one is more like claiming to be a friend or a DJ or a book writer than it's like claiming to have type AB blood or claiming to be in pain. So whether or not there actually is a determinate fact about what gender is and how you get one, there just isn't any general agreement about what properties make up someone's gender. Gender is taken by different people in different contexts to lie in anything from genitals to DNA to reproductive organs, to hormones, to what people feel their identity is on the inside, and there are various other options. What we agree about when we agree that someone is a man is generally not his genitals or his DNA or his inner sense of identity. And in fact, notice all of those things are typically hidden from public view anyway, so we don't even usually know about those things. What we agree about, first and foremost, is how he should be positioned in normative space. Conversely, if we find out that someone doesn't have a penis, say, and now we disagree over whether he's a man, we're not disagreeing about the facts about his genitals, ex hypothesi. What we're doing is contesting which norms should apply to him given the empirical facts. Right? So even if you insist that what you're doing with your words when you ascribe gender to someone is making a descriptive claim about which biological or social or psychological properties they have, the primary social effect of your words is not to inform people about these properties, it's to help insert and hold them in social norms. And likewise, if you're pervasively recognized as being a man, then you are subject to the norms of masculinity as a matter of social fact, regardless of the facts about your psychology or your biology or whatever. Now, two people might disagree over whether someone is a man because they disagree over whether having a penis is necessary, and maybe even necessary and sufficient for being a man, for instance. They might agree that Alfred has no penis, but disagree over whether Alfred's claims to being a man should be given uptake, because one person thinks that having a penis is a necessary condition for occupying the social role of being a man, and the other doesn't. In turn, this might be because they disagree about the metaphysics of gender. But notice that in all but some highly specialized contexts, although they might disagree because they have metaphysical differences, they are not disagreeing about the metaphysics. They're not having a metaphysical argument. Rather, what they're arguing about is how to give social uptake to Alfred. What their contrary gender ascriptions are doing is competing to position Alfred differently in social space. In fact, if they move instead to debating about metaphysics, which most people don't do, but philosophers sometimes do, they're likely going to move away from gender ascriptions altogether, and they're going to switch to making general statements about men and body parts. And that's a whole different use of language. I'm not making any claims in speech act theory about the status of that kind of metaphysical debate language. That's a very different kind of language from the speech acts that I'm talking about here. Another clue that competing gender ascriptions don't constitute a metaphysical argument is that it's completely, and I think this is really important, it's completely consistent to privately believe that someone has a particular gender because of their empirical properties, such as their genitals, and also at the same time believe that social claims to gender positions and identities should be routinely respected, even when the gender identity claimed doesn't match the actual gender. So in that kind of case, the person whose genital essentialist metaphysics causes them to believe that Alfred is not a man is still going to use language to ascribe manhood to Alfred, regardless of their private metaphysical beliefs. So regardless of your private metaphysical commitments, speech acts that ascribe gender constitute acts of social positioning. And even when these are based on an empirical judgment and an implicit metaphysics, they generally do not function to litigate that judgment or metaphysics. So I've emphasized that we're not claiming that having a recognized social role as a man is what it is to be a man. I'm remaining neutral on the metaphysics of gender. As I mentioned, Mark and I are both separately from our argument in this paper, I didn't mention this yet actually, we're both committed to the idea that any successful metaphysical account of gender would have to include trans men who are not socially recognized as men, and mutatis mutandis for trans women and for non-binary people. Since plenty of trans men don't get this social recognition, either because they're not out or because they don't pass, we don't actually believe that any form of pure social recognition account of the metaphysics of gender can be correct. I'm mentioning this now just to emphasize that in claiming that gender attributions hold people in gender roles, I'm not claiming that these attributions constitute gender identities. I'm claiming instead that it's public recognition of a social role that actually holds people in the norms attached to that role, regardless of what gender they actually have, and even regardless of whether the notion of having a gender is ultimately a coherent one. Okay, now, there are specialized contexts in which gender ascriptions do have primarily descriptive force, and there's general agreement as to which descriptive features of people the ascriptions are picking out. So doctors' offices, I think, are a good example. When you describe someone as a woman in that medical context, the description is generally serving to classify them on the basis of what anatomical parts they have, although not, interestingly, on the basis of their genetic makeup, except in very unusual specific circumstances. So doctors need to know whether someone needs a pap smear or a prostate exam, and we typically use the terms woman and man or female and male on forms in order to make those classifications. And we do things like talk about women's health clinics to talk about the places where you can get the pap smear, but not the prostate exam, and so on. But notice that although we do use gender ascriptions descriptively in those specific contexts, arguably we shouldn't. First of all, even in those cases, describing is not all that we're doing socially with these ascriptions. This is already clear from the effect that it has on trans and non-binary people. The practice results in their either being misgendered in medical contexts, or being shut out from appropriate doctors, or having to undo the effects of forms that render them at least temporarily medically unintelligible. In some contexts, medical classifications by gender have been used to explicitly restrict social standing. For example, medical tests that are imposed by athletic bodies that determine who can participate in gendered sporting events and things like that. So even in cases when the specific interaction is one that's geared towards seeking empirical information, you can't escape the broader social context and the richer pragmatic implications of a declaration, even on a medical form, that someone is a man or a woman. Second, this terminology is unnecessarily imprecise. What doctors should care about is not whether a patient is a woman, with all the potential variation and complication that entails on any account of what gender is, but just whether they have the relevant anatomy for a test or procedure. Not all women, including not all cis women, have cervixes, and some men and non-binary people have cervixes. So it's just more precise for forms and questions in doctors' offices that offer pap smears to ask people if they have a cervix than to ask them what their gender is. And we think that this argument generalizes. So if there's some empirical property of a person that we can, in context, pick out with a gender description, then you can do whatever descriptive and explanatory work you're doing in that context more clearly and without extraneous pragmatic effects, just by forthrightly and explicitly talking about that empirical property. So if you want to talk about genitals, talk about genitals. If you want to talk about DNA, talk about DNA. If you want to talk about psychological senses of self, talk about psychological senses of self, and so forth, clearly and explicitly. Eliminate the unusual and always semantically imprecise and pragmatically ambiguous uses of gendered terms for that purpose. And again, the argument for this eliminativism of descriptive gender talk applies regardless of what you think actually constitutes gender. The gender ascriptions always have potent social force and powerfully place people in normative space, and we shouldn't be casually doing that every time we want to pick out a descriptive property of a person that is typically associated with a gender. Now, if it's true that gender ascriptions primarily serve to place and fix us within normative space rather than to describe us, then accordingly, the primary way to assess their appropriateness is not in terms of their truth value. Instead, in assessing the appropriateness of a gender ascription, we need to ask whether the speaker has the proper authority to insert the subject of the ascription into a particular social position, and whether the reorganization of social space affected by the ascription is ethically acceptable. Remember, I said that earlier, if it's not a declarative truth claim, if it's a different kind of speech act, then its appropriateness depends on whether it's properly authorized and whether its normative effects, its social effects are acceptable. And these are substantive questions. There's no obvious answer to the question of when someone would have the proper authority to be entitled to insert someone into a complex social position with their words. And it's not obvious what the ethics of doing so are. So this is like a substantive philosophical issue that we think hasn't really been taken up yet. To begin to answer these questions, notice that it follows, I don't remember if I need to, yeah, sorry, I should have advanced the slide. It follows from the basic norms of self-determination and bodily agency that we ought to have defeasible control over how we are placed within social space and social norms. Now, obviously, this isn't an undefeatable norm. So if someone declares, I'm your sovereign, even if it's deeply psychologically important to them, accepting that is going to impose unjust restrictions on others. But in general, assigning other people a tightly controlled position that they haven't chosen for themselves is typically pretty much our definition of social repression. Right? This is why we consider caste systems and hereditary occupations and non-consensual arranged marriages and Jim Crow laws and so on to be fundamentally assaults on human rights. I want to take it as a basic tenet then that as long as it isn't hurting others and consistent with our capacities, we should be able to determine our social position for ourselves. And gender norms are extremely detailed and control us at a really basic bodily level. If they're inappropriately imposed, this seems to be an assault on our core bodily integrity and autonomy. As I just pointed out, people are not gently nudged into gender norms, they're jammed into them and they're held there hard with the full force of social and discursive power. So that gender ascriptions are not just trivial intrusions into our self-determination. This is especially so, but not only true, if one's trying very hard to extricate oneself from an imposed set of norms, for example, because you're transgender or agender. Now, gender ascriptions can be in the first, second, or third person voice. If gender ascriptions were just declaratives, then they would have the same content and force regardless of voice. They would just state the fact that some person has a particular property. But we're arguing that these three types of ascriptions in fact function as different, substantively different speech acts that are authorized in different ways and have different performative effects. While all three of them reorganize social space by placing someone within a set of norms, they do so in different ways, and they're not all equally entitled, even given the same empirical facts in the background. So what I'm claiming is what entitles me to announce my own gender, and what entitles you to tell me what my gender is, and what entitles someone else to report on my gender are all different entitlement conditions, even holding the empirical facts fixed. And that's an indication, if it's true, that these are not declarative claims. Moreover, the ways in which these three different kinds of speech acts reorganize social space are also different. And for the last leg of this paper, I'm going to give a more fine-grained analysis of the pragmatic structure of gender descriptions that distinguishes between the first and second and third person pragmatic voices. Okay. So first person gender ascriptions. First person gender ascriptions claim a social position. They function to request or maybe even to entreat or demand of others that they take the speaker as held to a set of gender norms, even if the person self-ascribing actually wishes to defy or play with or fight those norms. Likewise, first person rejections of a gender ascription, including rejections of all gender ascriptions, as in the case of some non-binary folks, request or entreat or demand of others that one not be taken as subject to a set of gender norms. Now, because we have, I've argued, a prima facie defeasible right to determine our own social location as part of our basic right to self-determination, these speech acts are prima facie entitled. I think the burden of proof lies on anybody who contests their entitlement, because unless there are special reasons, we should all get to determine our own position in social space, I've argued. We don't need any special ground for their authority beyond the general insight that people should get to choose how they're positioned in social space. And this is a right that in the case of gender is integrally connected to our right to control the motions and boundaries of our own bodies. If I say, I bet you $5, my speech act presupposes all kinds of descriptive beliefs, such as that I'm going to turn out to be right about whatever I'm betting about, that I can afford to gamble $5, and so on. But even if my factual presuppositions are wrong, I really did make the bet with my words. Likewise, if I announce I'm a man, even if my factual presuppositions are wrong, I really did, as an action, claim a masculine position in social space, and it's almost always my right to do so. I'm the one who gets to express where I belong in social space when it comes to something as intimate and pervasive as my gender. My claim that I'm a man then is not the kind of thing that can be straightforwardly deceptive any more than my claim that I bet you $5 can be, because the Speech Act helps create social reality rather than just reflecting it. My claim might be misleading because it might suggest facts about me that aren't true, but it can't be simply false. And this is true even if I take myself to be making just a descriptive claim with my self-ascription, because intentions don't dictate the performative force of my Speech Act. Regardless of my intentions, the primary social effect of my words is to insert myself into social space. And here we're in effect agreeing with Talia May Bechter, who argues that first-person gender ascriptions aren't reports, they're what she calls avowals, which are expressions of identity that are immune from straightforward contradiction. Importantly, their immunity is not due to there being infallible truth claims, because people can certainly be wrong or insincere about any empirical features of themselves. It's rather grounded in their ethical and political status as expressions of self-determination. If someone disagrees with my right to ascribe my own gender, then their disagreement should be on ethical, not factual grounds. That is, because my claiming of this social position somehow does harm to others, not on the grounds of my having gotten some set of empirical facts wrong. If I'm wrong to call myself a man, it's not because I made a false claim, it's because I'm trying to do something that I ought not to be allowed to do. In the case of claiming a gender, it's really hard to cook up cases where this would be so. My claiming a gender identity, unlike my claiming to be a sovereign or a spouse, is no imposition on anyone else. And because of our basic rights to self-determination and bodily identity, because these rights are wrapped up in our ability to claim our own social position in gendered space, the bar for such harm would have to be quite high. Now, I want to make a small note here about race before I go on. Before I move to second-person gender ascriptions, I need to say something about what might seem like a parallel case to the first-person gender ascriptions, and that's first-person race ascriptions. Various people who heard earlier versions of this talk asked me and Mark if our account commits us to respecting all first-person identity ascriptions, including, in particular, race ascriptions, even when those self-ascriptions might seem to contradict our social standards for racial classification. We have two responses to this. First, we want to emphasize that we're giving an analysis of gender ascriptions specifically, and we don't see any a priori reason to assume that the analysis of race ascriptions would be tightly analogous. And in fact, there seem to be important disanalogies between the two cases. Mostly these are beyond my scope here because this isn't a paper about race, but just to give an example, notice that we typically assign race based on intergenerational features. And likewise, the harms that we wish to undo when we think critically about race and engage in anti-racist action are harms that come from generations of sedimented structural disadvantage and compounding lack of access to social goods. And those can't be understood individually. So racial ascriptions implicate the identities of more people than just the person to whom they apply, whether they're first or second or third personal. And in this way, they're different from gender ascriptions. To return to our earlier point about the limits of self-determination, it might be that claiming a race turns out to be more like claiming that you're someone's spouse or that you're a sovereign than it is like claiming a gender. Again, I don't intend this to be like an analysis of racial ascriptions. It's just to highlight one way among many, one reason among many why the assumption that race and gender ascriptions have analogous pragmatics and ethics is unwarranted. But second, we do feel confident that there is a sense in which the two cases are analogous. Race ascriptions, like gender ascriptions, are not fundamentally declarative truth claims whose appropriateness depends on how they correspond with some stable set of empirical facts. Rather, both of them are normative moves that attempt to claim social space or place someone within that space. So likewise, both of them should be assessed on ethical and pragmatic grounds. Was this Speech Act properly entitled? Should this normative move be made? If first-person race ascriptions should not be given prima facie nearly indefeasible deference, the way we argue gender ascriptions should, this isn't because they're less likely to be true, it's because giving them recognition is more likely to do ethical harm. That's where the debate should be. Or because their entitlement conditions are different. Whether someone should get to have whatever racial agential identity they want and receive social recognition for it is a normative question about pragmatics in politics and ethics. It's not a question about the metaphysics of race. I mean, after all, the metaphysics of race is even murkier and more contested than the metaphysics of gender. So in this bird's eye sense, we are willing to say that race and gender ascriptions are analogous, even if the concrete, ethical, and pragmatic stakes turn out to be quite different in the two cases. Okay, on to second person ascriptions. First person gender ascriptions, we argued, are petitions to occupy a social position. They claim social space. But those positions within normative space have to get social recognition in order to be solidified as real. If I claim a position in normative space and I don't get any uptake for it, then nothing is actually going to hold me in that social place. So a first person gender ascription requires uptake in the form of second person gender ascriptions and recognitions, and these play an essential role in constituting the social positioning. In fact, we believe that all speech acts require second person uptake in order for them to have any norm shifting force. And we argue that we wrote a whole book to that effect, but we don't need that strong claim here. We just want to say that self-identification on its own can't constitute a gendered position in social space. But what I want to argue in this section of the paper is that for ethical reasons, second person identifications also should not on their own constitute gendered positions in social space either. So imagine that in the midst of a heist, I say, I'm taking charge here. And you reply, you're not the leader of this operation. As in other examples that I've brought up here, this is not an empirical disagreement. There aren't any separate facts of the matter that determine whether I get to take charge of the operation, or at least let's imagine that there aren't, right? There's no prior contract or anything. Rather, my claim that I'm taking charge isn't a description of fact here, it's a social proposal. And in response, your response is a challenge to my proposal. It's a rejection of my attempt to organize social space and my place within it in a certain way. And similarly with a second person denial of a first person gender attribution. This is first and foremost an act of refusing to engage with the speaker in the social mode that they propose. It's a repudiation of their call for social uptake, a concrete kind of pushback against their attempted self-placing in social space. Likewise, if you respond with, okay, you're the leader, or yeah, you are a man, you're not just describing an empirical fact, you're giving me social uptake and recognition that places me in the social location that I just petitioned to enter. So from the point of view of speech act theory, if second person gender ascriptions have these normative effects, then again, we need to ask first, who has the authority to impose these norms with their speech? And second, when is it ethical to do so? Generally speaking, people need special social credentials to shift social space with their words, and particularly to shift someone else's status in social space. So for example, only specific people can draft me into the army or establish a new law that turns me into a criminal or pronounce me married. And likewise, only certain people have social power to remove me from these social locations or deny me these statuses. So we need to ask, what social credentials could authorize someone to impose gender norms on me or deny me a place within them? We also have to ask whether this can be done against my will or without my autonomous agreement. Some changes in status require the autonomous participation of the person whose status is being changed, and some don't. So again, for example, someone with the right credentials can draft me into the army or impose new laws on me, but no one can marry me against my will in most countries, or enter me into a bed against my will, or consent to sex on my behalf, for example. So in the case of second person gender ascriptions, the question is twofold then. What authorizes these speech acts, and can they be authorized without first person autonomous participation and consent? In the case of drafting someone into the army or making them a professor, we have clear institutional standards for who has the entitlement to perform the speech acts that institute these statuses. It's notable and ethically crucial that there aren't any such institutional authorities when it comes to gender credentials. In fact, I'd claim that when doctors or parents or nosy outsiders take that authority upon themselves, they're helping themselves to a kind of an ersatz institutional authority that doesn't actually exist and whose mimicking does harm. I want to suggest that typically the only thing that can authorize a second person gender ascription is a first person gender ascription. Remember, the second person ascription is not just a statement of fact, So it's not just a repetition, it's a performative act of giving uptake to and solidifying someone's claimed position in normative space. Further, they are speech acts directed at the person in question. So to deny someone's first personally embraced gender is not just to seek to impose a social position on them, but to do so to them, to directly reject their self-positioning. Second person disagreements with first person gender ascriptions, then I want to claim, are almost never justified. There's just nothing that would give a second person the kind of social authority that they need to use their words to overrule a chosen role or to foist someone into a complex web of social norms unless they're invited or requested to do so by the person. On the face of it, since being gendered tightly constrains our autonomy and our bodily self-determination and agency, and since we value freedom over our social position, getting to self-ascribe our gender is a basic autonomy right. And we would certainly need an argument as to why anyone else could impose something like this on us without our agreement. At least the burden of proof is on someone to show why they have the standing and the right to do this and to override my basic social and bodily presumption of self-determination, especially when there are serious social and psychological consequences at stake. So the main point here is that shifting someone else's status in social space generally requires special credentialing, whether formal or informal, that gives the person the authority to do this. But generally, people haven't stopped to even wonder by what authority someone else could impose a gender status on me or take one away from me. If we interpret gender ascriptions as declaratives, then it can seem like such denials are just disagreements over facts. And of course, anyone has the authority to dispute a purported fact. But I've been arguing against this interpretation. And if gender ascriptions are not first and foremost declaratives, then the question of their authority conditions becomes vivid. Moreover, the ethical effects of unentitled second-person gender ascriptions are pernicious. Denying someone's right to self-position in social space has consequences for their self-determination and bodily agency, and it's a display of basic disrespect for their first-person authority. And that takes us finally to third-person gender ascriptions. Second-person gender ascriptions are entitled then only in the case of agreement with first-person attributions, or at least that's what I just argued. But in the third person case, we're often not in a position to ask someone directly or to have access to their self-ascriptions. So we routinely say, there was a man waiting for the bus this morning and things like that. And it seems really strong to claim that such speech acts are unentitled just because we don't have an entitlement passed on directly from the person we're talking about. Generally speaking, even if someone hasn't directly self-ascribed a gender, we can make a pretty good guess about their gender identity based on their social and physical self-presentation. These are also ways of telling us their gender, typically, though not always. These guesses can be relatively harmless if they're based on reasonable evidence, as they're typically just picking up on and reinforcing a position in social space that the person has already claimed. But they have to be treated as provisional and highly open to revision, and they should be avoided when there's any ambiguity at all in someone's gender presentation. We also think that they don't need to be as common as they are, because gender isn't relevant to our third person speech nearly as often as we include it. Now, one interesting complicated case is babies who aren't yet in a position to first personally claim a gender identity at all. It follows from our account that we should withhold gender ascriptions from babies until they're old enough to start claiming a place in gendered space for themselves. Our early gender ascriptions to babies and young kids are far from innocent, after all. Feminists from Simone de Beauvoir onwards have thoroughly documented this. These placings in gendered space radically constrain how a child grows up to move, look, act, experience, have possibilities open and closed to them, and so on. However, we suspect that this is too radical of a switch to get wide traction at this moment in history. So for now, we just want to urge that third-person gender ascriptions of babies should be as pragmatically gentle and provisional as possible. And once a child starts self-ascribing their gender or refusing to do so, disagreeing with or contradicting their self-ascription is an unjustifiable and unentitled act of social violence. Now, again, our concern here is with which speech acts are entitled and what those speech acts do in social space. So we're not talking about what beliefs about empirical facts people are right to hold. I might believe that someone is a man based on what I know about his genitals, his looks, his behavior, his DNA, or something else. Even if I don't have a well-developed metaphysical theory of gender, my belief might be a sensible inference based on the fact that other people who have similar body parts or similar behaviors routinely turn out to be men. But this doesn't mean that I'm necessarily entitled to ascribe a gender to him in public speech, because doing so does more than convey facts. It also inserts him into and holds him in normative space. That's what we've been arguing. So the bar for our entitlement to affect someone's social status is higher than the bar for our entitlement to form a private belief about them. The criteria for when we can do this, the Speech Act that is, are ethical and not merely descriptive. So to conclude, our arguments imply that first-person gender ascriptions and refusals of gender ascriptions, including refusals of all gender ascriptions, are almost always entitled, and second and third-person ascriptions that contradict first-person ascriptions are almost never entitled, regardless of the social, biological, or psychological facts about the person. They're unethical impositions on someone's basic self-determination, and they're more akin to pronouncing someone married against their will than to just describing them correctly or incorrectly. But this raises a puzzle. If second and third person gender ascriptions that don't inherit their authority from first person ascriptions aren't entitled, then why do they have a social impact at all? Why aren't they just pragmatic misfires in Austin's sense? After all, if I order my student to clean their room, I don't impart an obligation to them. I've just misused language. And once more, if I shout names at random babies, I don't succeed in naming them. So then, how do people succeed in imposing gender norms upon one another through language if they don't have the entitlement to do so? We want to finish by suggesting that this trick is based on a kind of a masquerade. Gender ascriptions pass themselves off as doing mere descriptive work, as just attributing descriptive properties to people. And as such, anyone would be entitled to utter such speech acts, and then we could debate their truth or falsity. But in fact, the normative effects of the Speech Act are smuggled in and given uptake and solidified. So gender ascriptions, even when they're not entitled, do their performative work by way of what we might call a constitutive misrecognition. We act as though in attributing gender, we're just reporting on pre-settled facts, while in doing so, we're actually constituting social reality. This is a kind of a pragmatic enactment of the naturalistic fallacy. We use speech to establish how things ought to be by acting like we're just reporting on how they already were. This logic of constitutive misrecognition is built into the grammar and the ideology of gender. Typically, using the surface grammar of a declarative to perform an exercitive or a speech act with a different elocutionary force doesn't lead to this kind of ambiguity or confusion. So when I say to my newborn child, "You are named Eli," I'm not confused over the fact that my speech act is constituting rather than describing Eli's name. But in the case of gender roles, these constitutive speech acts are situated within an ideology that pushes hard for essentialization and naturalization, casting our social position as an inevitable destiny. And in this context, the grammar of gender ascriptions helps to hide the equivocation between the constitutive work of language and its putative descriptive work. In other words, part of the way that constitutive misrecognition gets hidden in our grammar is through our systematic ambiguity in discourse around gender between describing social reality, describing intrinsic facts about empirical facts about individuals, and doing the constitutive work of placing people within normatively articulated social positions. We certainly don't need to be conscious of this strategy or this ambiguity. In fact, most people take themselves to be merely making descriptive claims when they attribute gender. This is what leads them to act as if they're calling someone's gender self-ascription into question is just a matter of having a healthy debate about the facts. Part of what I hope to have shown is why these apparent healthy debates over the facts are actually substantive and robust assaults on people's self-determination, and so why the practices encoded in that grammar call for revision. And I'll stop there.